And hello, everybody. Welcome to this Red and Rural webinar number 2 on messaging. My name is Raquel, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. Looks like we've got 4 minutes. So in the meantime, I just want to go over some group norms. First, I'd love for everybody to please introduce yourself if you have not already in the chat box. Please type your name, your indivisible group, and the city and state that you're calling from today. Make sure the chat box is set to everyone so that we can all see it. Couple of group norms. Everyone is muted to make sure that we can all hear the presentation as it's going. If you find yourself unmuted, please mute yourself. Thank you so much. Most of us have our videos off, but that's kind of up to you. For those of us using the Zoom app on a computer or on your phone, we're really counting on you to participate today. Make up for the lack of technology for the folks on the phone who are calling in and won't be able to actually participate in some of the fun features of Zoom. So we're gonna have a super robust discussion, but only if y'all participate. So thank you so much in advance. Another group norm, if you have a question at any point during the webinar, please type the word question in all caps in the chat box before you actually write your question. That way, our tech team can easily grab your questions so we can answer them at the end during our question and answer section. We are so glad that you're here to join us today. We'll get started in looks like 2 minutes. In the meantime, please type your name into the chat box with your indivisible group and the city and state you are calling from to introduce yourself today. And we will get started in just a few minutes.
Can you hear me?
Hi, yeah, we can hear you. Thank you so much for joining us. We will have an opportunity for folks to participate.
Please listen 1 second here. I can't.
There we go. Yeah, we ask that everyone please stay muted for right now. There will be an opportunity to participate and we will unmute you. So don't worry about needing to touch any buttons. We've got y'all covered. This way, everyone can hear the presentation as it's going. We don't have to worry about any background noise, any husbands or kids in the background. We'll have a great old time. Please introduce yourself in the chat box if you have not already, and we'll get started in just 1 minute. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining this Red and Rural webinar series. This is episode number 2 on messaging. My name is Raquel and we'll get started in just a few moments. For those just joining, please introduce yourself in the chat box. Type your name, your indivisible group, and the city and state that you're calling from today. A few things for everyone to know. Everyone is muted That's on purpose. Don't worry about it. To make sure that we can keep the conversation flowing. We will have chances for folks to participate. So if you really want to, you just may get a chance to, but we will do the unmuting. So don't worry about, don't need to touch any buttons. We will be using polls today. So for those of us on the computer or using the Zoom app, we really rely on you to participate so that we can have a robust discussion for folks joining us on the phone who unfortunately don't have the same abilities because of the limitations of technologies. Last sort of group norm, if you have a question at all through the presentation, please write the word question in all caps in the chat box before you actually type your question. That way our tech team can grab the questions from the box as they come in, and we will make sure that we get to them in the question and answer section. Thank you so much again for joining, and we will get started in just a few. Hello, hello. Welcome everyone to the Red and Rural webinar. We will get started now. Thank you all so much for joining us. Before I kick it off to Afton to start us off for this call, reminders of the group norms. Please stay muted. We will control your volume and sound when it's time to participate, so don't worry about touching any buttons. If you have a question, please write the word question in all caps before you write it out in the chat box. That way our tech team can easily grab your questions and we can answer them during the question and answer section towards the end of the webinar. Lastly, we are calling on folks who are using the Zoom app or the computer to really participate to make up for the lack of technology for folks who are calling in over the phone. Without further ado, I kick it off to Afton to get us started.
All right. Hello, everyone. I am Afton. I'm the Senior Regional Organizer for Tennessee and Kentucky for Indivisible, and I helped support the creation of the Raucous Rural Caucus, which started as a few rural groups in Tennessee meeting at the Highlander Center and supporting the work of rural organizing. We are incredibly excited to have you here at webinar number 2 of the 3-part Red and Rural webinar series, which is taking place right now during the regular Raucous Rural monthly call. So for those of you who join our monthly calls, welcome. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we're super excited you're here. You may or may not know that Indivisible, National Indivisible has a rural program and a really broad, exciting national network of which y'all are now part of by participating today. Go ahead, Raquel.
Couldn't find my unmute for a second. Thanks, Afton. I am Raquel. I didn't properly introduce myself earlier, so I apologize. I am a Senior Training Associate with Indivisible, specifically focusing on the Midwest, but in this lovely time of COVID, I get to work with everybody. And I work with the awesome Indivisible training team to develop content and put on trainings for the entire Indivisible network. And all of our work has been in support of the Indivisible Rural Caucus, like Afton just mentioned. And thank you again for letting me crash your meeting today to give you this training webinar. The Indivisible Rural Network is doing so much good work in rural communities. And in June, after the Red and Rural webinar number 3, after the series completes, we will have another opportunity to really engage with the virtual Rural Caucus. And I know Afton will have more to tell you about that later on, but it's going to be super duper awesome because comedian Trey Crowdy will be the MC. Woo! So we will send out the registration link for webinar number 3, as well as for the Rural Caucus in the follow-up email. So please be on the lookout to sign up. It will also be in other Indivisible emails as well. And in the meantime, we want to know who is in the audience by taking some polls. I'll kick it back over.
All right, thanks so much, Raquel. Welcome again, everyone. I'm seeing some familiar faces from Kentucky and Tennessee for my groups. Welcome, we're super excited y'all are here. So we'd like to start this call by taking a poll to learn about who is on the call today. And as we launch the poll, it should show up on your screen if you are using a desktop or the Zoom app on your phone. Once again, for those of you calling in, I will say the questions out loud, but you won't be able to select a response. And you know, as we know, rural broadband is a problem, and but we're wanting to make this as interactive as possible. So the first question that you should see pop up is going to be, how did you learn about this training tonight? We're super curious to hear how y'all were introduced to this. So the first answer is A, the Raucous Rural Caucus. So that means you probably receive an email from me. B, the National Indivisible email. C, our Indivisible Facebook. So perhaps you saw a Facebook post. D, a Medium post. Or E, other. So once again, if you are on your computer or your phone, the poll should pop up and you should be able to see it.
We are having a bit of technical difficulty, and so we're going to switch gears. Afton is going to give you those choices again. There were 3 choices. Choice A is going to be, you're going to click yes for the response. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a green check mark for yes. So Afton, what was the first choice?
Okay, the first choice was the Raucous Rural Caucus. So if you heard about this training through the Raucous Rural Caucus.
That you're going to check yes. Option B was what, Afton?
Option B was Indivisible email. Did you get this through the national email?
Okay, we're going to go and we are just winging it because our poll did not work. So for option B, you're going to click the X for no. And option C was?
Indivisible Facebook. So did you see a Facebook post indicating information about this webinar?
For option C on your screen, you're going to use the blue right arrows that say go faster. So for option A, you're going to click the green check mark. For option B, you're going to check the red X, and for option C, you're going to click the blue arrow that's pointing to the right. Thank you for rolling with us. That was, we just had to do that one on the fly.
So if you're on your screen, you should see under the participants, you should see the symbols that are designated. There's nothing to click. Kimberly, could you explain where they are on the screen? Would be helpful.
Yes, I see 12 people have said yes, 4 people have said no. I mean, and on your screens, they should be at the very bottom of the chat. At the very bottom of the chat, you should be seeing the different audience participation. We've got 14 people that have said yes. We've got 9 people that have said no, and 3 people who have said option 3. So Afton, that gives you a little bit of sense about where people have heard about this call. It looks like most people chose option B, and second was option A, and then the second was option B. And then we got people with another option, the other option.
All right. Well, that means that a lot of you are on my email list, but a lot of you are not. So guess who you're going to be getting an email from very soon. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and launch. So I think I have the ability to launch the poll. So I'm going to try to see if we can do this here. Okay, so let's see here. Can y'all see the poll in your screen?
Yes,
I see the poll.
We can see it. We are going to question.
Excellent. Okay, question 2, here we go. So how involved are you in Indivisible, if at all? So are you a group leader, which is A? B, are you a group member? C, are you just on our email list and you engage with us on Facebook? Or D, other? All right, and I'm seeing, yeah, keep voting. So you should be able to see the poll in your screen. So we've got a lot of people. Oh, great, everyone's moving through this very quickly. Okay, so I'm seeing for question number 2, how involved are you, if at all, in an Indivisible group? Okay, wow, the answers are rolling in. Y'all are you've got fast fingers, excellent. Okay, so a lot of you are group leaders. We've got 11 group leaders on the call, excellent. But a lot of you said others, so that's really interesting to me that you are maybe peripherally involved in Indivisible. Maybe you're a big Twitter fan of Matt Hildreth, and so you've found this link and you're excited to hear more from him. So that's really exciting. All right, we're gonna move on to question 3. So did you attend the Red and Rural webinar number 1? All right, so for the first response, we had A, which is yes, B was no, and C, yes, and I did the homework. Okay, well, let's see. We've got a lot of you that attended the first Red and Rural webinar number 1, so about 18 of you, but a lot of you didn't, so welcome, and we're super excited you're here. Welcome. Oh, and I'm seeing that a lot of you may have not done the homework, which is totally fine. We are organizing during a pandemic, and I'm offering all of the grace to all of you. So don't worry. And to be told, do not tell Raquel or Kat, but I also did not do the homework. So, but it's really exciting to see you're here, and thanks so much. All right, and the question number 4. So we still have people polling, responding to this. What do politics of your rural community look like? So we have, let's see here, 21% of you said deep red, which is response A. Response B is light red, so about 15% of you. Response C, all right, I'm gonna go ahead and end this. Oh, here we go. Okay, there we go. So let's go ahead and, okay, there we go. Now you can see it. Okay. So number 4, what do the politics of your rural community look like? We've got 51% of you said deep red. So welcome. I grew up in East Tennessee. I feel your pain. I know where you're coming from. A lot of you, so light red and then purple. So we've got some districts on here that maybe you've got a really progressive urban core, but the kind of adjacent community is pretty rural and red. And then we've got some other as well. So, and welcome the deep blue people. I know we have some folks from New York and Los Angeles who are really interested in rural organizing. So welcome, we're super excited y'all are here as well. All right, and lastly, 5, how does your Indivisible group communicate your message? So if you're part of Indivisible, what does your communication look like? So let's see here, we've got a few of you communicate your message through letters to the editor. Let's see, a lot of you post and share on Facebook. So I know all of my rural Indivisible groups started as Facebook groups. So Matt will speak to that and we're super excited. And then creating your own content, post to share. So that's came in 3rd place, and then others. So it seems like we've got a pretty wide variation of how you communicate to the outside world, which is exactly why we've got Matt Hildreth on this call, and we're super excited to have him here. So thank you so much for participating. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And I will now kick it back to Raquel.
Thank you, Afton. So we were going to take a brief moment to talk about the homework from webinar number 1. It's okay. I'm not a strict teacher. Kimberly Ann Tucker used to be a principal, so good thing she's not hosting this call. So I'm gonna let it slide that y'all didn't do the homework, but we definitely encourage y'all to continue to, you know, talk to your community members, try out that stuff that feels a little uncomfortable, because we need to build people into this movement. And especially right now when we're all stuck inside with COVID-19 and the elections coming up, it feels insurmountable, but we've all got this together, and people are really down to pick up the phone in this time. So right now I'm going to introduce Matt Hildreth. I'm very, very excited. He is going to be our guest presenter today. Matt has been working in rural communities as the executive director of ruralorganizing.org, an online resource hub for organizing around progressive values in rural communities. Using his technical background in broadcast journalism, Matt has worked with activists and local officials and partnered with campaigns to test the effectiveness of different messages on different demographic audiences, see how different things land with different people. The toolkits and handouts he is sharing as a part of this webinar, along with the other resources at ruralorganizing.org, are available to you all to help you and your group craft your message that will land with your audience and get attention for your group and grow the progressive base in your community, because that's really what it's about. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Matt.
All right, let's see if this works. Can you guys hear me? Let's see, I've got this is overwhelming, the technology. I thought I was good at technology, and then seeing so many people on a presentation is amazing. So I am gonna go through, can you remind me real quick on my time?
So you are, sorry, I need to reference my notes again. You're going to go until about 8:41 is when we're gonna start the question.
Okay. Great. Well, I am super excited to be included in this conversation. I was kind of scrolling through folks, and I think I see some familiar faces, and good to see a couple of different communities that I've lived in represented. So I'm actually really excited to be on this call, and I'm super excited about the work that Indivisible is doing with this Raucous Rural Caucus, or however you say it. I will say that I personally believe that Indivisible has probably the largest field footprint in rural America out of all of the progressive groups that exist in the country. If you look at where the progressive infrastructure has expanded the most, in rural areas, especially since 2016, it really is from the Indivisible groups. Just really think you all should take a minute and celebrate the work that you've been doing. We've definitely been seeing it sort of rise to the top over the last couple of years, and it feels like there's a fundamental difference that's changed because of the work that you're doing. So I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about communications training, and just to say who I am. My name is Matt Hildreth. I'm from the Midwest. I think that's the easiest way to say it. I was born in Wisconsin, grew up in South Dakota, went to college in Minnesota. My whole family's from Iowa, which is where I bought my first house. I now live in Ohio. So I've kind of bounced around a number of different places in the Midwest, but Midwest has been home to me for a long time. And I really like it here, and I'm really excited about the organizing that's happening here and in rural communities across the country. So just real quick about ruralorganizing.org. I'll just talk real briefly about our work. We kind of have a 3-phase change cycle to the work that we do. We first sort of believe in paradigm change, changing the paradigm, and then political change, which we think comes next, and then eventually policy change. So when I say paradigm change, what I mean about that is we are challenging the underlying assumptions that non-rural people have towards rural communities, but also that rural people have towards themselves. And we believe that challenging those stereotypes is a real important part of the work. We do that through a number of different ways. This was a panel that we had at Netroots Nation last year. The panel was called Rural Does Not Equal White. And it was really challenging the idea that rural communities are sort of code for white communities. 1 in 5 rural voters are voters of color, and that's something that we really want to remind people as we're doing this work. We also do it through cultural engagement. This is a bluegrass concert in Steve King's district. Steve King is, as you may know, is a white nationalist member of Congress who had his committee position stripped over the last couple of years. This was a bluegrass band that's made up of Joe Troop from North Carolina and Latin American musicians. So it's another way that we're really challenging those stereotypes. We also work with people like you might know Trey Crowder. I think he's going to be in the summit later on with Indivisible. He's a comedian known as the Liberal Redneck. So we work with him on projects. Also, we do work in the media with op-eds and pitching different types of media. So that's kind of the paradigm shift work. The political change work that we do is really leveraging distributed organizing like you see with Indivisible, sort of this grassroots-led work, and then also digital technologies to build progressive power in small towns and rural communities. So we do that through a number of different ways. We have campaigns that we're running currently in Kansas. We did one in Kentucky last year for the governor's race there. We hold a lot of trainings like this one. We've done trainings like this is Newark, Ohio. This is in Tennessee. This is an Appalachian community in Ohio. And now I ended this screenshot from today. So this is our first Zoom training like this. So you all are a part of that work now. And then the other thing that we do is policy change. So we have our digital platforms that are rapidly growing, and we leverage these digital platforms to promote progressive policies. So this is a campaign, actually over the last couple of days, this campaign broke 400,000 signatures. This is a campaign that we did demanding that the federal government fully fund the United States Post Office. Some of you might have taken action on it. We also did one around SNAP. And we have a number of these campaigns. So our email list has been growing rapidly over the last couple of years, and we're really trying to push for that progressive policy agenda, specifically focused on rural solutions to rural problems. And I just want to talk very briefly about rural voters. You guys, judging by the polling response, you know why engaging rural voters matter. But I just want to say real quick my perspective on that. And this is the case that I make often to non-rural people, and we do that quite a bit. And before I get into this, I'm not going to spend time on USDA continuum codes. I will say that like the standard way to think about this is if you've been to one rural community, you've been to one rural community. Rural means a very different thing in a lot of different places. So as I'm talking, you know, take everything that I'm saying with a grain of salt, because you know, it might be different in your community. But when we're talking about rural, just to sort of know what we mean, we often break it down by large metro, small metro, and non-metro counties. And so when you think about it that way, this is kind of what the United States population looks like. So large metro makes up about two-thirds or 3/4, sorry, of the voting population, and then about 1/4 of people live in small metro and non-metro. Small metros would be small cities. Non-metros would be more of those rural communities. And then to simplify it even more, for this conversation, we're going to really be talking about non-major metro voters. And that is the reason that we're doing that is because that really expands, I think, where progressives need to engage their footprint. So when you think about the communities that we're talking about, we're talking primarily about metro areas that are smaller than 250,000. So Yakima, Washington, if you're from the Northwest, or Fort Smith, Arkansas, Fargo, Binghamton, New York, Appleton, Wisconsin. So we're really talking about any community that's smaller than that. And so this is Yakima, Washington. You can see it has some, oh, Appleton's in the group. That's great to see. Yakima has, it has a little bit of a downtown to it, if you're picturing kind of the communities we're talking about, but then it has a rural area about that. And then also Appleton, Wisconsin. So here we're counting that in a lot of the conversation we're having today. If you're from a remote rural community like I am in South Dakota, you would hear Appleton, Wisconsin, and you would think, oh boy, that's a big city. I don't have a stoplight in my community. So just before we get into this too much, I want to talk about what I mean when I say rural. Basically, we're talking about, for the purpose of this conversation, anything outside of those major metro areas. All right. I can get into the designations about towns that are 4,500 people. Those would be considered probably a non-metro county. So you would definitely be included in this. But when we're talking about this very oversimplified general idea of outside of major metros, this is how the 2008 election broke down. And it's, as you can see here, you have in the light blue, Obama's performance in large major metros. And then you have Obama's performance in the dark blue in the non-large major metros. So the dark blue is the group we're really talking about today. You can see also with McCain, the dark red is the non-major metro voters that McCain had. Now watch when I'm going to switch this over to 2016, and you'll be able to watch what happens. It's important to note that white line going down the middle, that represents the popular vote. Here's what it was like for the Hillary Clinton election in 2016. You can see, so once again, this is 2008 here, and then this is 2016. You can see, of course, Hillary won the popular vote, but when you look at the Electoral College, and you can see that compared to what Obama did, this is Obama's numbers again in 2008, just by going down from 11% to 9% outside of major metros, it had an impact on the election, obviously, as we all know today. And that's because, this is an article from after the 2016 election, rural America, even as it laments its economic weakness, retains a vastly disproportionate electoral strength. And the electoral system, this is something we've talked a lot about since 2016, gives rural voters more clout than urban ones. So what's happened is when the party stood for both city and country, that bias affected them both. But the Republican Party has become disproportionately rural, and the Democratic Party has become disproportionately urban, which means a red vote is worth more than a blue one. Let me see if I can figure out how to get this bigger for you all. Did that look better? All right. I don't know if that makes it better or not. All right.
Much better. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for the text. All right. The other thing why we need to be engaging these voters is because young voters in rural areas, and this is true in in the small metro areas like the Appletons and the Yakima, Washingtons, are swing voters. And in 2018, the young voters in these communities were dramatically larger than compared to the past. 18 to 29-year-olds in these communities had a 25-point swing from voting for Republicans in 2016 to Democrats in 2018. 30 to 44-year-olds, there was an 18-point swing. So that is something to remember, especially young voters outside of major metros are swing voters. But something that is really important to me as somebody that grew up in rural America, it's not just about politics for me. Rural America has been really struggling the last couple of years, especially since the recession. And for the first time in a century, the United States is seeing a sustained decline in life expectancy from birth. And that's specifically coming from drug overdoses and suicide, which are hitting rural areas far harder than urban areas. And so one thing is we never want to pit urban versus rural. We really want to focus on a both and strategy, but there is stuff that's happening in rural America that is unique to rural America. And that's something that we really want to be paying attention to. And that's why for us, this is Jay Schulten, who's running in Northwest Iowa, kind of highlighting our agenda. We're really focusing on increasing people's wages, decreasing their daily expenses, and then defending the rural way of life, which we really focus on as looking out for each other. So just to really summarize this real quick, rural engagement matters because the GOP runs up the margin in rural areas. Rural voters have a structural advantage. rural young people are swing voters, and rural America is struggling. That's why we really think that we should be focusing on rural America. So I just want to talk very quickly about how we understand rural voters. We kind of start with this concept. It's a controversial concept in Washington, D.C., but we believe that just maybe rural people understand rural America better than DC consultants. Often what happens is in the Beltway, people want to know what rural America thinks, so they go and they talk to some K Street lobbyist. That's not what we do. What we did in the past is we focused specifically on talking to our members. And so what we did in 2017 is we asked our progressive members, in your opinion, what's the #1 reason progressives struggle to win in rural communities? And so I'm not going to maybe struggle with the technology here, but I'll just say if you put it in the chat, I can see the chat. Sorry for those on the phone that aren't able to participate in this. But what do you think? Why do you think progressives struggle to win in rural communities? You can put A in the chat if you think it's because they don't understand issues in rural communities, because progressives take the wrong stand on issues. That's B. C is because progressives don't know how to talk to rural voters. And D, rural voters don't agree with progressive policies. Let's see what we got here. Yeah. Okay, I don't have the regressions here on your statistics, but very clearly that that you guys are saying progressives don't know how to talk to rural voters. Well, maybe I'm biased, but that's what our numbers showed too. So, I think that there's definitely reasons. Somebody said all of the above. I think that's probably pretty accurate as well. So, so what we really did is dove into understanding how rural voters, how we can kind of bridge this gap between kind of progressives and rural. That's why our tagline is boldly progressive, proudly rural. We don't think you have to choose between either identity. And we use polling. And the reason we use polling is because in mass communication, polling is our best form of feedback. So if you've ever been in some form of public communication, you know, sometimes it can feel kind of lonely. You're out there, you know, championing your idea, but without polling, you don't really know what people think of it. I mean, unless you're getting booed off the stage or something like that, it's really hard to know if you're connecting with people. So for us, we really believe that polling helps us understand the bias we bring to a conversation, especially a public conversation. And it helps us evaluate ourselves as communicators and as leaders. And we believe fundamentally that polling should make us more authentic, not less. So the goal is not to like find some secret code word to try and, you know, some silver bullet to trick people into supporting us. The whole point is to understand how we are actually engaging with people. So through the polling that we've done, we found this is probably true for many of you, especially in the deep rural red areas that it seems that a number of the people on the call are in. 60% of voters outside of these major metros consider themselves to be conservative or moderate. Is that, just if you shake your heads, I'm looking at most people on the camera, is that true? Two-thirds of rural people? Some people actually think that's low, but our polling definitely shows that. This is kind of a rough breakdown that sort of represents kind of what we're talking about here. But you can see the blue and the light blue is the chunk of people that identify as liberal and progressive. It's about 22%. So it's not completely nothing, but nationally, it's definitely, you know, less. Also, something that's important to note for this election is 76% of all voters, so this is metro, non-metro, everybody, believe that they've already made up their mind about the 2020 election. So who we're talking to is actually a pretty a small group of people. That being said, as I mentioned before, our polling shows that millennials and Generation Zs living outside of these major metros are more likely to be undecided voters than any other non-large metro demographic. And additionally, we're seeing also that independents, especially independent women outside of major metros, appear to be movable ahead of the 2020 election cycle. I think that's something to keep in mind, is we're not going to be able to convince everybody. A lot of people have already made up their minds. Our motto at ruralorganizing.org, it's our informal model, but it's lose less. Because you know, we're not gonna reverse a trend that started with 30 years of disinvestment among progressives in rural areas, but we can, like we saw with those numbers from 2018, we can cut the margins, and that's what's been happening, especially because of the work you all are doing over the last couple of years. The other thing that I think is important to say, we think about Trump voters as Fox News voters, but people outside of major metros get more of their news, or more people outside of major metros get more of their news from Facebook than from Fox News. So this is what it looks like. The mustard color is all voters. The teal is small and non-metro. So the teal is the demographic that we're really talking about today. So this was, people could select multiple sources here. So they're not just selecting one or the other. But you can see here that especially local news and Facebook are an important way of communicating to this demographic. If you live in a community like that, you probably know that to be true. Some of these got cut off, sorry for that. I'll send out the full deck. I think I'm going to send through Afton a link to all of our resources, and this will be available to you as well. But it's important to keep in mind that not all of these people have the same information as you do, right? Like, we all pay attention to the news. We're watching it, everything develop day to day. But especially on Facebook, right? There's not a lot of reliable information out there. So the work that you're doing on Facebook, I think, is especially important. When we talk about to rural voters about top issues, this is a question where people could submit their own questions. However we cut it, number one issue is always healthcare. That was true before COVID. That's especially true in rural communities, but healthcare is always a big issue. It was interesting to see in our last round of polling, Democratic solidarity, which basically means making sure Donald Trump loses, was number 2. And so we don't want to forget about those, what we would call base voters, but that's something we want to keep in mind on. Illegal immigration and jobs in the economy. Legal immigration is their term. I wouldn't have used that word, but that was how they responded to it. That would probably be a good indication of Trump voters. But interesting to see Republican solidarity defeating Democrats was much, much lower than the energy on our side. So I think that's an important thing to remember. All right. I am going to go a little bit over, but I think this will be okay. One thing to remember, there's broad agreement among non-metro voters that the government is not serving their needs. And we asked this in a couple of different ways in our polling. One of the questions was, elected officials don't listen to people like me, agree or disagree? And you can see that actually in those the small and non-metro areas, 94% of Republicans agree. And so Republicans, interestingly, feel very alienated from their politics. 98% of independents. Democrats agree at a very high level too, but interesting to see that that was slightly less. And then this is something, this was kind of testing for that populism that you see, especially I think in rural communities. We asked whether or not people agree or disagree with the statement that social and political elites impose their will on my life. And so we tested that. You can see that broken down by non-metro voters and small metro voters. There's something about the small metro voters, the people that are living in the cities that are like from 250,000 to 20,000. Those would be the small metros. I think a lot of those had loss of industry. And so they have a little bit more of what sociologists would call rural resentment. Here's another kind of statement where there's broad agreement across Democrats and Republicans. 80% of non-metro voters believe, and it's non-metro here, but it was a similar number in small metros, so we just have non-metros, but 87% of non-metro voters believe that the government mostly reflects the will of the rich and influential. In Iowa, a lot of people, I think, were surprised by the performance of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, especially in kind of the white rural communities. And I think a lot of that is because of this populist, there's a real rich history of progressive populism in some of those communities. Here's something that I think is really important to remember. A lot of people think, oh, we need to talk about how Trump is hurting farmers with the ag economy and the trade war. Rural people actually don't believe that statement. And I think it has to do with complex ideas around trade, and that a lot of people feel like NAFTA wasn't a good thing for their community, and they feel like, getting holding China accountable and fixing NAFTA in the long run, even though they're hurting in the short term. In the long run, they'll be better off. This was interesting because we tested this statement in urban areas, and urban people think that Trump is bad for rural America at a much higher rate than rural people do. So I think that's important to remember where there's agreement and where there's disagreement. Just real quick, a couple areas where there is a lot of agreement. 86% of non-metro voters think tax incentives should prioritize small local business over major corporations. This is huge. There is small business. I think sometimes Democrats have walked away and progressives have walked away from small business populist sort of language. Time and time again, we see that it's not just enough to be anti-corporate, but also being pro small business. And I think that's something we forget. We always talk about, you know, the corporate, anti-corporate stuff, but we're not talking enough about small business. So that's something that, that we think. All right, I'm going to ask a question. If you want to put it in the chat, I think that would probably be the easiest for the sake of time. So what does this data tell you about the voters you're trying to reach? All right, let's see. Looks like some people are chatting. Does anybody distrust government? That's right. Reach young voters. That's right. We have a lot of work to do. That's right. They feel disenfranchised. That's definitely true. Not that different from us. I tell you what, I worked on immigration politics, and one of the things I will say is that the community values that we talk about in rural America are very evident in a number of different communities. And so sometimes people like to talk about small town communities. And I think identifying those community values across the spectrum is, there's a lot of space for common ground there. All right. Young people who are not sucked up in the brain drain are cynical and wary. Yeah. So here's the thing I will say real quick on the brain drain. I hate that term. I know it's everywhere, but there is the people that live in rural communities, we are finding want to live there. And so sometimes I think it's, there's this element of outsiders not really liking rural communities, but for the people that live in rural communities, they really want to be there. And so I think finding people who truly like the rural living to communicate the message. Often we find that messengers matter more than messages. And at our Netroots Nation panel, Francis Johnson, who was the moderator, said that you can't organize who you don't love. And that to me really hit home, is that sometimes this, you know, if we're not authentic, if we don't actually care about the people, they can feel it. All right, a lot of other great comments in here. If you have questions about any of the specifics, you can email me. It's just matt@ruralorganizing.org. I'll try and follow up as fast as I can. All right. I do want to talk just real quickly about healthcare and COVID. We did a lot of polling over the last couple months on this. I wrote this right before the presentation, and there's a typo. 57% of non-major metro voters I wrote this with double negatives. The stat is they disapprove of allocating money to corporations. I'll clean this up when I send it out. Sorry for that typo. Oh, here it is. Actually, it was a copying error. This is the real stat. All right, it was much higher than that. That's what I was trying to remember. 98% of non-metro voters disapprove. Sorry, these typos. Oh, no, this is right, sorry. 98% of non-metro voters approve of allocating stimulus money to small businesses. So this idea of putting money, the stimulus money to small businesses, when it comes to the COVID response, these getting money out of corporations' hands into small business hands is the #1 thing that people are believing right now, and that's what they're wanting right now. Also, the stimulus checks were widely popular. I think that's probably pretty obvious. 85% of non-large metro voters approve of the stimulus checks. 76% of non-metro voters approve of increasing emergency funds to SNAP or food stamps. So this was I think something that's really important. We fight hard for SNAP. The number goes down a little bit if you talk about the long-term increase in funding, but right now people strongly support emergency funding for SNAP. Then interesting to see 55%, now this polling was a couple weeks old now, but about half of people believed that their hospitals and clinics are not adequately prepared for the coronavirus outbreak. About 40% are seeing a decrease in their value of their investments. So that would be a lot of their retirement. 30% have reported losing actual income. So people are getting hit really hard by the economic piece of this. But when it comes to the actual implications from the health, the actual health implications, people are a little bit more split. So 50% of non-metro voters say that they're more likely to vote for candidates who says that everybody should have the option of enrolling in Medicare. This probably surprises some people. So that's split, but when we're talking about the fact that usually we're losing in rural America by 18 to 20 points, when you talk about being 50-50, that's actually a really good number for us. So here's where we see 48% of non-metro voters don't believe Donald Trump adequately prepared for the coronavirus outbreak. So these would be, Trump country. I try not to use that phrase, but these would be Trump country voters. Still, about half of them feel like Donald Trump was not adequately prepared. So if you're talking about the economic implications, if you're talking about the economics, you're talking about small businesses getting stimulus over corporations, you're talking to 85%. But when you start talking about the politics and the partisanship around Donald Trump specifically, then you can see that it gets to be about 50-50. All right. 41% of non-metro voters think the federal government has not gone far enough to slow the spread of the coronavirus. So it is, that's a little bit higher than I would have thought. But I think once you get into these questions that are specifically around Donald Trump, and sort of partisan identifiers and things like that, people go to their party corners. And so I think that's something to kind of just keep in mind. All right, I do want to talk just real quick, sorry, I got just a couple more minutes on how we engage rural voters. So this is something that I think is relevant to your work, whether you're giving a speech or you're speaking at a press conference or you're posting something on Facebook. I would try and think about it this way. We want to talk about when we're crafting our message, when we're crafting our Facebook post, when we're crafting our press release, we always want to talk about why we're doing what we're doing, how we're going to do it, and what we're going to do. And this is kind of a concept that just comes from marketing in general, but you always start with why first. A lot of times we'll talk about, we're going to pass this policy, or we're going to vote for this person, or we're going to do this. You talk about how you're going to do what you're going to do. People often forget to talk about why they're doing the work that they're doing, and why the work that you're doing is the most important, because people's motivation comes from their values. I just saw a question in the chat about faith-based people. That's especially true in faith-based communities. I come from, I come from a faith-based community, and that's, I think, especially, it's a little bit maybe more natural for people in a faith-based context because we talk about our testimony and all that kind of stuff. And I think that that's really an effective way to communicate. So we tested some polling that is around what we call community care or community kind of compassion framing. And this did really, really well. And so this is kind of what we suggest. And it's relevant to faith-based, but I think to a lot of different people. And it's this idea that we all want what's best for our loved ones, and helping our neighbors, regardless of their background, is an important part of the rural way of life. That's why we need a president who cares about all groups in my community. That has wide support. Now, we're not talking Republican or Democrat here. So there's Republicans that agree with this. There's Trump voters that are agreeing with this. So it's important to remember that this isn't some sort of magic silver bullet. This is just, people want the members of their community to be taken care of. And that's pretty universal. We also did some stuff with what's called the race and class narrative. I'd recommend checking it out from Demos. They do amazing work. And there's a lot of work being done this election cycle around this. But here we got a little bit more specific about what we're talking about. And it goes like this: instead of delivering for working people, most politicians hand kickbacks to their donors, lobbyists, or corporate CEOs who send jobs overseas. They then turn around and blame new immigrants or people of color to divide and distract us from the real source of their problems. We need a president who will fight for all Americans, not divide us up for their own political gain. That still has strong support. We compared this to other kind of more just generic, nonpartisan, we need a government that looks out for us. And this did actually better than those messages by 10 points among Democrats. And then for some reason, independents and Republicans really respond to this message. Our pollsters say we need to do more work on this question because it's possible people just sort of read about delivering for working class people and they don't read the whole question. And so they just say they agree without getting fully into it. But we see without a doubt that this kind of community care framing works. And so we kind of would sum it up this way, that we would say, we all want what's best for our loved ones. Now more than ever, we need leaders who are on our side, not politicians who will create divisions in our community for their own political gain. Attacking immigrants and people of color is irresponsible and does nothing to ensure our friends and neighbors have access to the quality jobs we deserve, the affordable health care we need. That's why we should choose a president who cares about about everyone in our community, a president who will fight for all of us. So that's kind of the framing that we get at. Now, I know I'm over by about 8-10 minutes. Sorry about that. I do have what I would call real world examples, specifically on healthcare, because on all issues, Donald Trump is most vulnerable on healthcare. And I think rural people are very concerned about healthcare. And so maybe I was gonna make this a little bit more of participation. I can just kind of go through these quick?
Yeah.
Or what do you want to do? Sorry.
No problem. If you could go through these quickly, I would love to save some time to answer 1 or 2 questions, but we can circle up and make sure we get very solidly typed out answers that we can still share with everyone, even if we don't have an opportunity to get to a lot of them. So go ahead.
Okay. So I would say, how would you craft a healthcare message based on everything that we've learned so far? So maybe you can kind of think to yourselves how you would do that. And I will say, first, we want to start by talking about why, right? We talk about start with our values first. And we want to say, why is healthcare important to us? What are our values? So before we talk about anything else, we want to establish our values. So I would start with something like this if I was using kind of that general framing that we discussed. We all want what's best for our loved ones, and helping our neighbors, regardless of their background, is an important part of the rural way of life. So before we've even started getting into healthcare, we're just establishing that in rural communities, we look out for each other. So then we can get to the how. How do we get to healthcare? What is our strategies? What actions will we take? So there's a number of different ways to think about this. But I would say you could think about it this way. In America, we should ensure that all members of our communities get the care they need. But instead, a handful of corporate monopolies now run our entire healthcare system and ensure politicians pass policies that protect their profit margins. And then you could get into what will be the results. And so it's a little bit, could be a little bit clearer, but I would say, what will be the results? I know that people power still works in America, and when we vote, we're not just voting for ourselves, but we're also voting for our communities. That's why I will vote for candidates who will ensure that everyone in our communities have access to the healthcare that they need. So that's kind of a way to do it. Yeah, so I'll maybe just stop there. And if you guys have questions, if anybody has questions, you can email me individually, matt@ruralorganizing.org. Or I think we could take a couple now too. It sounds like we have a little bit of time.
Yeah, I think we have time for 1 question. Thank you again. And of course, like I said, we will find a time for us to connect with Matt offline and get the answers to the rest of the questions that you have put into the chat box. But the question that we will do for right now is, how do we talk about fake news? And how do we sort of craft our message to undercut fake news, since it is so prevalent and so easy and very distracting?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I would say that my experience is that that's really the role that Indivisible, I think, plays, right? Because if anything that we do at the national level, anything that's happening kind of up here, big, far away from each other, it's a lot easier to understand it as fake news. I think that the more that you're actually having conversations with people, something that I like to say is that the only solution to ideology is reality. And so when people have to have a conversation, I think that people having a conversation with each other, it's harder to have a fake news response if you actually know the person that's telling you, if it's a trusted conversation. Here again, I would say this is where the messenger matters often more than the message. And so building those relationships and building those connections with the people in your community go a long way. I will say groups like Indivisible Appalachia, Ohio, they're doing things where they're going to the county fair and they're, buying a hog and they're getting it to the food pantry and, making sure people know it's coming from their Indivisible group. That is how they're building trust in their communities. And that's going a long way to establish that trust. So that, there's no substitute for that trust. And I think that's where we have to start. The second thing I will say is it's really easy to get focused on the people that, fall for the fake news, but there's a huge chunk of people out there that aren't getting any information. And I would say probably start with them first, right? Like the people that are just too busy working 2 or 3 jobs, that don't have time to sit at home and watch Fox News or sit on Facebook all day. I think those are the people that tend to agree with us the most because they know what's at stake. And so the more that we can reach out to them and sort of engage them, I think that's a big chunk of it. And I think that's especially true when you look at the voters under 40 in these communities, under 44.
All right, thank you so much. And I did apologize we didn't get a chance to get through all of the questions, but everyone will get an answer. Everyone will get a document with the answer to the questions that were submitted in the chat box. Additionally, everyone will get a copy of the materials and a recording of this webinar. We can also send out the webinar and materials from number 1 from the welcome, as well as you will also receive a registration link for number 3 and for the Rural Summit in the email that follows this. So thank you again, Matt, for your fantastic presentation. And now we like to go into a section we call, let's try it out. So in this section, as organizers, we know there's always an ask, the activity or action that you want people to do. And our ask for you all is to craft your own message. Use the handouts, which will be coming in the follow-up email. The handouts with the links to handy resources like a crisis messaging plan that will be linked in the email following up. That is a really good guide to start to craft your own message, as well as the framework that Matt shared with us, starting with the why we're doing this, then going to the how we're going to do what it is we're going to do. So if you are a group leader, this is a great exercise to do with your group. Use it as the activity for one of your next Zoom meetings. If you have, just lots of friends or just very, very active, maybe in other spaces, not specifically Indivisible, take this to them as well. Use this exercise with them, or do it as a solo exercise, just sitting by yourself when you're really contemplating the world but don't know what to do from your couch. Write out a messaging plan to spread the progressive message as far as we can. And we are running out of time. We are actually at time now, so I will kick it over to Afton for the last closing message. And thank you all for coming.
All right. Wow, Matt, a big thank you. I know I'm in the Matt Hildreth fan club. I'm sure all of you are. Please follow him on Twitter. A big thank you to Raquel. So thank you so much for coming. I hope all of you are able to connect with one another and learned a lot from Matt. As we mentioned in the beginning, the fun continues with our first National Digital Rural Summit featuring rural powerhouses such as ruralorganizing.org, People's Action, and American Federation for Teachers. I'm going to go ahead and drop the summit link in the chat box. We will also send you an email with the information. But with that, please sign up for the summit. We're super excited. Once again, we'll have the third part in this webinar series on June 10th. And you can also sign up for that. And once again, sorry for the rush, but we will go ahead and make sure that you receive all of this in the email. Thanks so much for coming, and we hope all of you have a wonderful, wonderful night.